Some airlines once flew planes so strange that it sounds made up. One European flag carrier borrowed a Soviet jet just to sneak across Russian skies. Another painted a military transport in passenger colors and quietly put it on the schedule. And a few major names leased odd little props that didn't even match the rest of their fleet. These stories are not well known. Most of these aircraft vanished almost as fast as they appeared. Let's look at the 30 aircraft you won't believe actually flew. Number 30, Swissair, Douglas DC-5. Only 12 Douglas DC-5s were ever built, and Swissair somehow ended up with a couple of them just before World War II. That already tells you how rare this plane was. While the rest of Europe was moving toward aircraft like the DC-3 and DC-4, Swissair was experimenting with something that barely existed. The DC-5 first flew in 1939, but production stopped almost immediately when the war broke out. Swissair's example was one of the only ones ever to fly commercial passengers in Europe. Today, only fragments of DC-5 history remain, and Swissair's role is often forgotten. Number 29. Qantas, Boeing 707-138. Qantas was not just a customer for the Boeing 707, they were the only airline to fly the special short-bodied version called the 707-138. It's because Australia's long routes demanded more range, and Qantas pressured Boeing to redesign the jet. Boeing shaved almost 10 feet off the fuselage, added more fuel, and delivered a plane that existed only for Qantas. No other airline in the world flew it. These planes entered service in 1959 and carried Australians across the globe at a time when few airlines could even manage non-stop flights. The funny twist is that by the 1960s, Qantas was already moving on to newer models, leaving the rare 707-138 as a weird footnote. Some of these aircraft later went to other airlines and even private owners, but they always carried that unique DNA that screamed Qantas only. Number 28. Japan Airlines, Tupolev Tu-114. The Tupolev Tu-114 is one of the strangest partnerships in airline history. In the late 1960s, Japan Airlines teamed up with Aeroflot to operate joint flights between Tokyo and Moscow, and the plane they used was a Soviet turboprop the size of a Boeing 707. This was no ordinary turboprop. The Tu-114 was a monster with swept wings and huge contra-rotating propellers that made it the fastest propeller-driven aircraft ever built. Japan Airlines painted its logo right next to Aeroflot's hammer and sickle, and for a few years, Japanese passengers boarded a Soviet plane for international service. The politics alone made it dramatic. Japan and the USSR weren't exactly friendly neighbors, yet here was Japan Airlines putting passengers on a machine that sounded like a freight train in the sky. It didn't last long, but those flights remain a wild chapter in the airline's history. Number 27, KLM, Ilyushin IL-62 KLM, one of Europe's oldest and proudest airlines, once relied on a Soviet jetliner. In the 1960s, Western airlines couldn't easily cross Soviet airspace, but Moscow had the leverage. So when KLM wanted better access to Asia, they struck a deal with Aeroflot. The result was that Dutch passengers found themselves boarding the Ilyushin IL-62, a long-range Soviet jet. It looked sleek with its rear-mounted engines, but it was notoriously heavy and inefficient. Still, it gave KLM bragging rights about flying direct to destinations that others couldn't reach. The IL-62 wasn't in the KLM fleet for long, but the fact it wore their colors at all is shocking. Number 26, Brussels Airlines, Sukhoi Superjet 100. Between 2017 and 2019, Brussels Airlines took a gamble. They leased the Russian-built Sukhoi Superjet 100 for short-haul European flights. On paper, it was supposed to be a modern regional jet, rivaling Embraer and Bombardier. But in reality, they faced reliability issues, spare parts shortages, and delays. Passengers boarded thinking they were on a sleek new jet, but inside the airline, mechanics were scrambling to keep the planes flying. Brussels was one of the very few Western European carriers to ever operate the type, and they quietly ended the lease after 2 years. Number 25, Qatar Airways, Boeing C-17 Globemaster III. Now this one doesn't even sound real. For a short time, Qatar Airways had a Boeing C-17 Globemaster III in its colors. Qatar's government wanted to promote humanitarian missions, so one of the C-17s operated by the Qatar Emiri Air Force was painted in full Qatar Airways livery. The idea was to show that the country could deliver aid quickly and globally. Spotting this plane at airports was surreal. A hulking gray military transport suddenly wearing polished airline branding. Passengers never boarded it, of course, but it was officially counted as part of Qatar's fleet. Aviation fans went crazy trying to photograph it. Eventually, the paint job was removed, but the images remain. It's one of the boldest cases of branding colliding with military aviation. Number 24. British Airways, Boeing Chinook helicopter. British Airways once flew Chinook helicopters. the same type famous for military missions, with its twin rotors thundering through the air. Back in the early 1980s, British Airways ran a division called British Airways Helicopters. They actually bought 6 civil-configured Chinooks to operate oil-rig shuttle flights in the North Sea. The project didn't last. The Chinooks proved too expensive to run, and British Airways sold them off by the mid-80s. But it left behind one of the strangest fleet chapters in British Airways history. The world's classiest flag carrier once operated heavy-lift helicopters usually seen in war zones. If that doesn't surprise you, nothing will. Number 23. Air China, Lockheed L-100 Hercules. The Lockheed Hercules is another aircraft you don't expect to see with passenger colors. Yet in the late 1970s, during the short honeymoon phase of US-China relations, Air China took delivery of civilian L-100 Hercules transports. These were basically C-130 military cargo planes stripped of guns and repackaged for commercial service. Only about 100 were ever built worldwide, and Air China ended up with a few of them. They used the aircraft mainly for rugged freight routes, carrying goods into remote parts of China. By the 1980s, China was modernizing with Airbus and Boeing deals, so the L-100 faded away. Number 22. Air China, Learjet 45. By the mid-2000s, Air China was expanding fast, but not every plane in the fleet was a widebody. Between 2004 and 2007, the airline quietly operated the Learjet 45 as part of its VIP and government transport wing. These small business jets weren't for regular passengers, they were reserved for officials, executives, and special missions. Seeing the Air China livery on such a tiny jet was bizarre, especially parked next to a Boeing 747. It shows how even giant state airlines sometimes need small, flexible aircraft to move people quickly. The Learjet 45 served for only a few years before being replaced by newer corporate jets, but it still counts as one of the strangest types ever tied to Air China's fleet. Number 21. Cathay Pacific, Learjet 45. Cathay Pacific is known for its long-haul fleet of Boeing 777s and Airbus A350s, but in 2001, they too had a Learjet 45 in service. Not for VIPs for pilot training, Cathay based the jet in Australia and used it to train new cadets in handling jet aircraft before moving them up to bigger planes. The jet was only used for a short time, but it proves how even the biggest airlines sometimes rely on unexpected tools. Number 20. British Airways, Vickers VC-10. The Vickers VC-10 was a proud British jet designed to handle the toughest airports in Africa and the Middle East. Its rear-mounted engines gave it power for hot, high-altitude runways that would challenge a Boeing 707. But by the time British Airways inherited it in 1974, the jet was already on the decline. British Airways kept it only until 1976 for long-haul routes, mostly to Africa. Passengers loved it because it was quiet inside and had a smooth ride, but the economics were brutal. 4 thirsty engines meant the VC-10 burned through fuel like no tomorrow. In the end, British Airways moved on, leaving the VC-10 as a nostalgic icon that aviation fans still talk about. But the airline doesn't highlight it much anymore. Number 19. Iberia Lockheed L-1011 Tristar. The Lockheed L-1011. Tristar wasn't Iberia's pride and joy. It was more like a quick fix. In 1997 and 1998, Iberia leased a few TriStars to handle high-demand flights to the Canary Islands. These planes were stripped into all-economy layouts to carry as many tourists as possible. The TriStar was already an aging design by then, so it felt a little out of step with the modern fleets of the late 90s. But Iberia needed capacity, and the TriStar got the job done. Then, just as quickly, it disappeared. Number 18. Air France, Lockheed L-1011. Tristar Air France also had a brief fling with the TriStar, though in an even stranger fashion. Between 1989 and 1991, they operated just one single L-1011. It was used for transatlantic flights, filling gaps in capacity while Air France was modernizing its fleet. The TriStar had advanced systems for its day, like auto-land capability, but by 1990, it was already becoming a relic. Air France dropped it after only a couple of years, making it one of the strangest one-off fleet members they ever had. Number 17. Aer Lingus, McDonnell Douglas MD-11. Aer Lingus's short experiment with the MD-11 between 1998 and 2001 still raises eyebrows. The Irish carrier wet leased the tri-jet for transatlantic routes during peak demand. Painted in Aer Lingus green, the long, stretched fuselage earned the nickname the Pickle. It wasn't exactly a perfect match. The MD-11 was known for its fuel-burning habits and tricky handling compared to the A330s and 747s that competitors were flying. Still, for a few years, Irish passengers crossed the Atlantic in one of McDonnell Douglas's final wide-body designs. When the lease ended, Aer Lingus went back to Airbuses, leaving the MD-11 as a rare and quirky blip in their otherwise straightforward fleet history. Number 16. Finnair, McDonnell Douglas MD-11F. Finnair has a deep history with the MD-11, being one of the last passenger operators of the type. But in the early 2010s, they briefly ran the MD-11F cargo version. These freighters hauled goods long after the passenger jets were retired, mostly on routes between Europe and Asia. Finnair's MD-11F career didn't last long, though. Airbus A350s entered the fleet, and belly cargo on those efficient wide-bodies replaced the need for dedicated freighters. Number 15. Icelandair, Boeing 747-100. Icelandair is basically married to the Boeing 757, but in the early 1980s they briefly flew the legendary 747-100. The plane came from SAS and was leased between 1982 and 1984. For a small island nation carrier, suddenly operating the world's largest passenger jet was a bold move. The 747 handled high-volume routes across the Atlantic, but it was far more capacity than Icelandair really needed. Operating costs were high, and the airline soon decided it made more sense to stick with smaller, more efficient planes. The 747-100 vanished from their fleet after just 2 years, but the thought of Icelandair running a jumbo jet is still one of those rare aviation trivia facts that surprises even occasional travelers. Number 14. Malaysia Airlines, Airbus A310. The Airbus A310 was designed as a smaller wide-body for medium-range flights, and Malaysia Airlines gave it a short trial in 1990. They used it mainly on flights to India and Pakistan. These were the markets that needed extra seats, but didn't justify a 747. The A310 was comfortable for passengers, but Malaysia's time with it was brief. As the airline grew, it leaned heavily into larger long-haul jets, like the 747 and eventually the A330. The A310 faded away quietly, remembered only by those who flew it during its short stint. Number 13. Emirates, Boeing 37-300. It's hard to imagine Emirates without wide-bodies, but when the airline launched in 1985, they didn't start with A380s and 777s. One of their very first planes was a Boeing 737-300, leased from Pakistan International Airlines. The 737 handled regional flights around the Gulf, while Emirates was still building its brand. For passengers used to thinking of Emirates as a luxury long-haul carrier, the idea of boarding a humble 737 feels almost comical. But without those first few short-haul hops, Emirates wouldn't have had the foundation to grow into the giant it is today. The 737 left the fleet quickly, making it one of the rarest Emirates aircraft ever. Number 12. Qatar Airways. Boeing 757-200 Qatar Airways also has a forgotten narrow-body chapter. In 1997 and 1998, the airline briefly operated a Boeing 757-200. It didn't last long before being transferred to Royal Tongan Airlines. The 757 felt out of place in Qatar's evolving fleet, which was already aiming for an all-Airbus long-haul strategy. But in the early days, the 757 gave them flexibility for mid-range routes. Few photos even exist of the jet in Qatar colors, and many aviation fans don't realize it was ever part of their history. Number 11. Singapore Airlines, Boeing 757. Singapore Airlines is known for being picky with its fleet. They stick to wide bodies like the 777s, A380, and a 350. But in the early 1980s, they actually leased a Boeing 757 for regional operations. It was completely out of character. The lease was brief, and soon SIA returned to its usual strategy of wide-body only. Number 10. Delta Airlines, Saab 340. The Saab 340 was never meant to be a Delta airplane. Yet after the merger with Northwest in 2008, Delta suddenly found itself with 49 Saab 340 turboprops in the fleet. These planes had served Northwest Airlink for years, connecting small towns across the Midwest. Delta is an airline that built its reputation on big jets, like the 767 and 777, and it suddenly owned dozens of tiny Swedish prop planes. Passengers either loved them or hated them. The ride was bumpy, the cabins were cramped, but they got people to places no jet could land. By 2011, Delta retired the type, closing the chapter on one of the most unusual fleet fits in its modern history. Number 9. Ryanair, ATR 42300. Before Ryanair became the all-737 powerhouse it is now, it experimented with the ATR 42300. From 1988 to 1992, the Irish low-cost airline operated turboprops for short hops around Europe. These planes were small, seating about 40 passengers, and they didn't match the aggressive low-fare model Ryanair was dreaming up. Maintenance, training, and turnaround times didn't fit with the future 737-only strategy, but for a few years, Ryanair passengers boarded a propeller aircraft that looked nothing like the blue and yellow 737 we know today. Number 8. Korean Air, Fokker F-28 Fellowship. In the 1980s, Korean Air added the Dutch-built Fokker F-28 Fellowship to its fleet for regional services. It was meant to be a reliable little jet for domestic routes, but the aircraft's history with Korean Air turned tragic. In 1989, one of the F-28s crashed on approach to Gimpo Airport in Seoul, killing most of those on board. The accident overshadowed the type's short career with the airline. Korean Air quickly phased the F-28 out, moving to more standardized fleets. Number 7. Turkish Airlines, de Havilland Canada -7. The de Havilland -7 was a turboprop designed for short takeoff and landing. It had STOL capability that let it fly into tricky airports. Turkish Airlines used it between 1983 and 1986 on domestic and regional routes. With 4 small prop engines, it looked different from anything else in their fleet. It wasn't a long-term fit, though. Fuel costs were high, and the -7 couldn't compete with jets on busier routes. By the late 80s, Turkish had already dropped it in favor of more conventional aircraft. Number 6. EVA Air, Airbus, A321-200 EVA Air is famous for its wide bodies, especially the 777 and A330. That's why it's shocking that between 2007 and 2009, they operated exactly one Airbus A321-200. The aircraft flew regional routes around Asia and even made it as far as New Zealand, filling a gap in capacity. But with only a single unit, the economics made no sense. After 2 years, the A321 was gone, and EVA doubled down on wide bodies. Number 5. Saudia, Beechcraft Bonanza. When you think of Saudia, you think of 777s, A320s, and long-haul jets. But in its training fleet, the airline once had the tiny Beechcraft Bonanza. This 6-seat piston aircraft is better known as a private plane in the United States, not something tied to a national carrier. Saudia used it for pilot training, teaching cadets the basics before moving them up to jets. Compared to the massive aircraft parked on the tarmac in Jeddah, the Bonanza looked almost like a toy. Yet it played an important role in training the next generation of Saudi pilots. Number 4. British Airways. Citation CJ3. British Airways has had its fair share of unusual side projects, and one of them was BA Private Connect. In 2010, the airline operated the sleek Cessna Citation CJ3 business jet to cater to high-value customers who wanted private jet flexibility with a BA label attached. The experiment didn't last long, but the sight of a BA tail on such a small aircraft was enough to turn heads in private aviation circles. Number 3. Lufthansa, Cessna Citation CJ3/XLS+. Even Lufthansa dipped into the private jet market. Starting in 2008, the airline ran a business jet division that used Citation CJ3s and XLS+ aircraft. These small jets were marketed as Lufthansa Private Jet, offering tailored service for executives who wanted speed and convenience without the hassle of commercial airports. Like BA, Lufthansa eventually scaled back the program, but for a few years, passengers could actually say they flew Lufthansa in a 6- or 8-seat private jet. Number 2. Emirates, Airbus A319CJ. Emirates doesn't just fly the biggest passenger jets in the world. It also has one of the smallest. The Airbus A319CJ, configured for just 10 passengers, joined the fleet as part of Emirates Executive, their VIP service. This plane has private suites, a shower spa, and lounge-style seating. It's the A380 experience, distilled into a business jet. Unlike most of the rare fleet members on this list, the A319CJ still flies today in a niche role. Number 1. United Airlines, BAC-111. In the mid-1960s, United Airlines did something that shocked the US industry. They leased the BAC-111, a short-haul jetliner built in Britain. At a time when American carriers were proud to showcase homegrown Boeing and Douglas jets, United brought in a foreign competitor. The BAC-111 served domestic routes but was quickly phased out, partly because US manufacturers were pushing their own alternatives. Which of these strange fleet experiments do you think is the most shocking? Tell us in the comments below. And before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the latest aviation updates. We will keep you in the loop. Goodbye for now.